June 16, 1944. The beaches of Saipan, Mariana Islands. In the pre-dawn darkness, Colonel Yoshitsugu Goto prepared 44 tanks for what would become the largest armored assault of the Pacific War. His Type 97 Chiha medium tanks and Type 95 Heigo light tanks represented the finest armor the Imperial Japanese Army could field. Each crew had trained for this moment, the decisive counterattack that would drive the American Marines back into the sea. Their 47mm guns had proven effective against lighter targets throughout the Pacific Campaign. Standard doctrine assured them that mass tank assaults, executed with Bushido spirit, could overcome any enemy position. Through the humid tropical air, engine noise echoed as Japanese armor moved toward the Marine beachhead. Tank Commander Mitsuo Kubo checked his ammunition one final time, confident in his weapon's proven capabilities. The Americans had landed their own tanks, M4 Shermans with 75mm guns. But numbers would decide this battle. 44 Japanese tanks against scattered American positions. The mathematics seemed simple. At 0400 hours, Goto gave the signal. Tracks churned through coral sand as the largest tank formation in Pacific War history charged toward destiny. What happened in the next 60 minutes would shatter everything Japanese tank crews believed about their weapons, and reveal a technological reality that would haunt them until dawn. The assault on Saipan began at 0530 hours on June 15, 1944, when the first wave of Marines hit the beaches under the thunder of naval bombardment. Major General Holland Smith's forces faced immediate resistance from deeply entrenched Japanese positions, but the initial landings proceeded according to plan. What the Americans did not know was that Colonel Yoshitsugu Goto had been preparing his response for months, a concentrated armor assault that would demonstrate the full power of Japanese tank doctrine in the Pacific theater. Goto commanded the 9th Tank Regiment, attached to the 43rd Division of the Imperial Japanese Army. His force represented the largest concentration of armor Japan had ever assembled for a single engagement in the Pacific War. 44 tanks formed the core of his striking power. 31 Type 97 Chiha medium tanks, armed with 47mm Type 1 guns, and 13 Type 95 Heigo. Light tanks mounting 37mm weapons. These vehicles had proven their effectiveness throughout the China campaign and in early Pacific operations, where their speed and maneuverability had overwhelmed surprise defenders. The Chiha tanks weighed 15 tons each and could achieve speeds of 25 miles per hour across favorable terrain. Their 47mm guns fired armor-piercing shells capable of penetrating 25mm of steel at 500 meters, adequate performance against the light American tanks Japan's intelligence reports suggested they would face. The Hago light tanks, at 7 tons each, sacrificed protection for mobility, their thin armor barely 12mm at the thickest points. But Japanese doctrine emphasized that properly coordinated mass attacks could overcome individual vehicle limitations through sheer numbers and aggressive tactics. Goto's plan called for a nighttime assault launched from the high ground north of Chiran, Kanoa, striking directly at the American beachhead where Marines were still consolidating their positions. Intelligence suggested the Americans had landed some armor, but reports remained vague about numbers and types. Japanese reconnaissance had identified what appeared to be medium tanks, but without clear specifications of their capabilities. This uncertainty did not concern Goto. His force outnumbered any probable American tank concentration, and Japanese crews had trained extensively for exactly this type of massed assault. The regiment's supporting infantry numbered nearly 1,000 soldiers from the 43rd Division, armed with Type 99 rifles, light machine guns, and portable anti-tank weapons. These troops would follow closely behind the armored spearhead, exploiting any breakthrough the tanks achieved and preventing American infantry from targeting the vehicle's vulnerable rear areas. Artillery support came from divisional guns positioned in the island's interior, ready to lay down covering fire once the assault began. On the American side, the 2nd Marine Division had established a precarious foothold on Saipan's western beaches. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Puller's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, held positions directly in the path of Goto's planned attack. Puller, already legendary for his combat leadership in earlier Pacific campaigns, recognized the vulnerability of his extended lines. His Marines had dug in quickly after landing, but the coral terrain made deep entrenchments difficult and gaps remained between defensive positions. The Americans possessed their own armor in the form of M4 Sherman tanks from the 2nd Tank Battalion. These 30-ton vehicles mounted 75mm M3L40 guns, weapons originally designed for the M3 Lee tank, but proving highly effective in the Sherman's rotating turret. The Sherman's frontal armor measured 50mm thick on the hull and 38mm on the turret, both plates angled to increase their effective thickness against incoming rounds. Side armor averaged 25mm, while rear protection dropped to 19mm at the thinnest points. Staff Sergeant Ernest Diller commanded one of the lead Sherman tanks positioned near the Marine perimeter. His M4A2 model burned diesel fuel rather than gasoline, reducing fire risk if penetrated by enemy shells. The tank's crew of 5 included himself as commander, a gunner, loader, driver, an assistant driver who also operated the hull-mounted machine gun. Each Sherman carried 71 rounds of 75mm ammunition in various types, armor-piercing for enemy tanks, high explosive for fortifications and infantry, and white phosphorus for marking targets or creating smoke screens. American anti-tank capabilities extended beyond the Shermans themselves. Marine infantry companies carried M1A1 bazookas, shoulder-fired rocket launchers that propelled 2.36-inch projectiles capable of penetrating 4 inches of armor at close range. Each bazooka team consisted of 2 Marines, one to fire the weapon and another to load the rockets and provide security. The weapon's effective range reached only 150 meters, but in the confined terrain of Saipan's coastal areas, enemy tanks would have to approach within that distance to be effective. Regimental weapons companies deployed 37mm M3 anti-tank guns at key positions throughout the Marine lines. These lightweight weapons could be moved quickly by their crews and hidden among the coral formations that dotted the landscape. While their penetrating power was limited compared to larger guns, the 37mm weapons could damage or disable the lighter Japanese tanks at ranges up to 1,000 meters under ideal conditions. As darkness fell on June 16th, both sides completed their final preparations. Goto assembled his tank commanders for a last briefing, emphasizing the importance of maintaining formation during the night advance and concentrating fire on American strongpoints rather than dispersing effort against individual targets. Japanese doctrine stressed that tanks should never fight alone. They achieved maximum effectiveness when operating as coordinated units that could overwhelm defensive positions through concentrated firepower and simultaneous attacks from multiple directions. The colonel's confidence stemmed from more than just numerical superiority. Japanese tank crews had extensive experience in night operations, a skill developed during years of fighting in China, where darkness provided concealment from enemy aircraft and artillery. The crews knew how to navigate by compass bearing and maintain formation without lights, using predetermined rally points and terrain features to coordinate their movements. This expertise gave them what Goto believed was a decisive advantage over American forces still adjusting to Pacific conditions. Private First Class Mitsuo Kubo checked his Type 97's 47mm gun one final time, ensuring the breech mechanism operated smoothly and ammunition was properly secured. As loader for his tank's main weapon, Kubo's responsibility was to maintain a steady rate of fire once the engagement began. He had practiced the loading sequence countless times until it became automatic. Extract the spent case, select the appropriate shell type, ram it home, and prepare for the next shot. In the confines of the Chiha's turret, efficiency meant survival. At 0400 hours on June 17th, Colonel Goto's tanks began their final approach toward the American positions, engines growling through the humid tropical air as 44 armored vehicles prepared to test Japanese doctrine against American steel. The first Japanese tank crested the ridgeline at 0415 hours, its Type 97 Chiha silhouette clearly visible against the pre-dawn sky. Staff Sergeant Ernest Diller spotted the movement through his Sherman's periscope and immediately alerted his gunner. Within seconds, the Marine positions erupted with activity as sentries passed word of the incoming assault. Lieutenant Colonel Puller's voice crackled over the radio network, coordinating defensive fires as more enemy tanks appeared along the horizon. Colonel Goto's lead elements descended the slope in a wedge formation, engines roaring as drivers pushed their vehicles to maximum speed across the broken coral terrain. The Japanese commander had positioned himself in the center of the formation, directing the assault through hand signals and radio commands to his subordinate tank leaders. His plan called for overwhelming the American positions through sheer momentum, driving straight through the Marine lines before defensive fires could be properly coordinated. Private First Class Mitsuo Kubo felt his stomach lurch as his Chiha tank bounced over a coral outcropping, the suspension system straining under the vehicle's 15-ton weight. Through the tank's vision blocks, he could see muzzle flashes erupting from American positions ahead. His tank commander shouted orders over the engine noise, directing Kubo to prepare armor-piercing rounds for the main gun. The loader's hands moved automatically, selecting the proper ammunition from the racks beside him. The first exchange of fire came at 600 meters range. Japanese 47mm guns opened simultaneously, their muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness as armor-piercing shells streaked toward American positions. Kubo watched his tank's gunner traverse the turret, tracking what appeared to be an enemy tank partially concealed behind coral formations. The Type 1 gun fired with a sharp crack, its shell visible as a brief streak of light crossing the battlefield. Diller's Sherman absorbed the impact without penetration. The Japanese armor-piercing round struck the tank's frontal slope at a steep angle, the steel projectile deflecting upward into the darkness with a shower of sparks. Inside the Sherman, the crew felt the impact as a jarring blow, but the tank's thick armor had done its job. Diller's gunner immediately returned fire with the 75mm gun, sending a high-explosive shell toward the muzzle flash that had revealed the enemy position. The American return fire demonstrated the vast disparity in firepower between the opposing forces. Where Japanese 47mm guns fired shells weighing 1.6 kilograms, the Sherman's 75mm weapon launched projectiles weighing 6.3 kilograms. The difference in striking power was immediately apparent as American shells began finding their targets among the advancing Japanese tanks. Kubo's tank absorbed multiple hits within the first 2 minutes of engagement. Armor-piercing rounds from American 37mm anti-tank guns penetrated the Chiha's thin side plates, sending fragments ricocheting around the crew compartment. The tank commander slumped forward, blood streaming from wounds caused by spalling steel. Kubo continued loading ammunition even as smoke began filling the turret, his training overriding the growing panic he felt. Japanese tank doctrine had not prepared crews for this type of engagement. The 47mm guns that had proven effective against Chinese armor and fortifications simply could not penetrate the Sherman's frontal protection. Shell after shell bounced harmlessly off the American tank's sloped armor, the deflected projectiles creating brilliant displays of sparks, but causing no damage to the vehicles or their crews. Sergeant Major Robert Brown coordinated the Marine infantry response from his position behind the main defensive line. His men had deployed M1A1 bazookas at key positions, waiting for Japanese tanks to close within effective range. The rocket launchers required careful positioning. Their 2.36-inch warheads could penetrate Japanese armor, but only if fired from the side or rear at distances under 150 meters. The tactical reality became clear within minutes of first contact. Japanese tanks attempting frontal assaults against Sherman positions found themselves outgunned and outarmored, their weapons ineffective against American steel. Those vehicles that tried to maneuver for side shots exposed themselves to bazooka teams and additional Sherman tanks, positioned in overwatch positions throughout the Marine perimeter. Goto recognized the crisis developing in his assault and attempted to adapt his tactics. Instead of continuing the frontal attack, he ordered his remaining tanks to disperse and seek cover among the coral formations, hoping to engage American positions from concealed locations where his guns might find more vulnerable targets. This change in tactics, however, only worsened his situation by breaking up the concentrated firepower that represented his only advantage. Individual Japanese tanks, isolated from mutual support, became easy targets for coordinated American fires. Marine infantry teams moved forward with bazookas, using the coral terrain for concealment as they stalked enemy vehicles. Each isolated tank faced attacks from multiple directions, Sherman guns engaging from long range, while infantry teams closed for killing shots from the flanks and rear. The Type 95. Hago light tanks suffered the worst casualties. Their 12mm armor provided virtually no protection against any American weapon, and their 37mm guns proved even less effective than the Chiha's 47mm weapons. Several Hago tanks were knocked out by rifle grenades and satchel charges when Marine infantry teams managed to approach close enough for hand-delivered attacks. Kubo's tank took another penetrating hit through the engine compartment, this time from a 75mm high-explosive shell that detonated against the vehicle's rear plate. The explosion killed the driver instantly and started a fierce fire in the engine bay. With their tank disabled and burning, the surviving crew members had no choice but to abandon the vehicle. Kubo emerged from the turret into a battlefield illuminated by burning tanks and continuous muzzle flashes. American artillery joined the engagement as Marine forward observers called in fire missions on concentrations of Japanese armor. 105mm howitzers from the division's artillery battalions began dropping shells among Goto's tanks, the high explosive rounds proving devastatingly effective against the lightly protected vehicles. Even near misses could disable tanks through concussion damage, or by destroying external components like tracks and road wheels. The Japanese assault, which had begun with such confidence, was disintegrating under the weight of American firepower superiority. Tank after tank fell victim to weapons their crews had never encountered in their previous combat experience. The Sherman tanks, which Japanese intelligence had dismissed as inferior to German designs, proved more than capable of handling anything the Imperial Japanese Army could deploy against them. Diller's Sherman crew methodically engaged target after target, their 75mm gun proving lethal at ranges where Japanese weapons remained ineffective. The tank's superior optics and fire control systems gave the American crew decisive advantages in target acquisition and engagement. Each shot was carefully aimed, with the gunner taking time to ensure hits rather than wasting ammunition on hasty shots. By 0500 hours, 31 of Goto's original 44 tanks had been destroyed or abandoned. The surviving vehicles were scattered across the battlefield, most of them damaged and unable to continue fighting effectively. The largest tank assault in Pacific War history had become a catastrophic failure, destroyed by American weapons and tactics that Japanese doctrine had never anticipated. Private First Class Mitsuo Kubo crouched behind the burning wreckage of his Chiha tank, watching in disbelief as another Japanese armor-piercing shell ricocheted off a Sherman's frontal plate in a shower of orange sparks. The 47mm round, which should have penetrated any tank Kubo had ever encountered, simply deflected into the darkness like a thrown stone bouncing off a castle wall. His hands trembled as he gripped his rifle, not from fear, but from the crushing realization that everything he had been taught about tank warfare was wrong. Across the battlefield, similar scenes of futility played out as Japanese tank crews discovered the inadequacy of their weapons. Tank Commander Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka, leading one of the few remaining Chiha tanks still mobile, ordered his gunner to close the range to 300 meters before engaging an American Sherman. The closer distance should have guaranteed penetration, but Tanaka watched in horror as his shell struck the enemy tank's turret face and bounced skyward, leaving only a bright scar on the steel surface. The Japanese crews began attempting increasingly desperate measures to achieve effective hits. Some commanders ordered their gunners to target the Sherman tank's tracks and road wheels, hoping to immobilize the vehicles even if they could not destroy them. Others tried firing high-explosive shells instead of armor-piercing rounds, reasoning that the blast effect might damage external equipment or injure crew members through spalling. None of these improvised tactics proved successful against the Sherman's robust construction and well-protected crew compartments. Colonel Goto, still directing the failing assault from his command tank, radioed frantically to his remaining vehicle commanders. His voice carried the strain of a leader watching his carefully planned operation collapse in real time. Intelligence reports had never mentioned American tanks with armor this thick, or weapons this powerful. The Sherman tanks were supposed to be inferior designs, hastily built machines that Japanese steel and determination could overcome through superior tactics and fighting spirit. The emotional toll on Japanese crews became evident as the engagement continued. Veteran tank commanders who had fought successfully through China and the early Pacific campaigns found themselves helpless against an enemy they could not damage. Radio communications filled with frustrated reports of ineffective fire and requests for different ammunition types that might prove more successful. Loader crews worked frantically to keep guns supplied, switching between armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds in desperate attempts to find something that would work. Kubo observed a nearby Heigo light tank attempt to flank a Sherman position by approaching through a grove of palm trees. The 7-ton vehicle's 37mm gun opened fire at point-blank range, its shell striking the American tank's side armor. Even at this close distance, with the shell hitting perpendicular to the armor plate, the projectile failed to penetrate. The Sherman's turret traversed slowly toward the Japanese tank, its 75mm gun elevating to engage. The Hago's thin armor provided no protection against the return. Fire! A single American shell completely destroyed the vehicle, killing all crew members instantly. Marine bazooka teams capitalized on the Japanese crew's growing desperation and confusion. Corporal James Mitchell led his 2-man team through the coral formations, using the noise of battle to mask their movement as they approached disabled enemy tanks. The M1A1 bazooka's 2.36-inch rocket could penetrate the side or rear armor of any Japanese tank, but the weapon required careful positioning and steady nerves to use effectively in close combat. The psychological impact of weapon failure extended beyond individual tank crews to affect the entire Japanese force. Infantry soldiers supporting the tank assault watched their armored spearhead being systematically destroyed by enemies they could barely see. The tanks that were supposed to break open American defensive positions and create opportunities for infantry exploitation instead became burning obstacles that illuminated Japanese positions for enemy gunners. Staff Sergeant Ernest Diller's Sherman crew maintained a methodical approach to target engagement, their training and superior equipment allowing them to fight with calm efficiency while Japanese crews struggled with inadequate weapons. The Sherman's periscopic gun sight provided clear target acquisition even in the pre-dawn darkness, while the tank's gyro stabilizer helped maintain accuracy while moving across rough terrain. Each 75mm shell fired by Diller's gunner had a high probability of destroying or disabling its target. Japanese attempts to coordinate fire from multiple tanks against single American targets also proved ineffective. Even when 2 or 3 Chiha tanks engaged the same Sherman simultaneously, their combined 47mm guns could not achieve what individual weapons had failed to accomplish. The American tank's armor was simply too thick and well-angled to be defeated by the Japanese weapons, regardless of how many shells struck the target. The failure of primary armament forced some Japanese crews to attempt close-range attacks with secondary weapons. Machine gunners fired long bursts at American tank vision blocks and periscopes, hoping to blind enemy crews or force them to button up and reduce their effectiveness. These attacks achieved minimal results, while exposing Japanese tanks to devastating return fire from Sherman coaxial machine guns and high-explosive shells. Sergeant Major Robert Brown coordinated Marine infantry movements to exploit the confusion among Japanese forces. His men advanced in small teams using abandoned enemy tanks as cover while they positioned bazookas and rifle grenades for close-range attacks. The Japanese infantry supporting the tank assault found themselves caught between their own disabled vehicles and advancing American forces, unable to provide effective protection for the surviving armor. Radio intercepts revealed the growing desperation in Japanese communications as tank commanders reported their inability to damage American vehicles. Some crews requested permission to withdraw and regroup, while others asked for artillery support to suppress enemy positions. Colonel Goto maintained his orders for continued attack, but his voice betrayed the strain of commanding a force whose primary weapons had proven completely inadequate. The technical specifications that had seemed adequate on paper proved catastrophically insufficient in combat. Japanese 47mm armor-piercing shells, designed to defeat 25 millimeters of steel at 500 meters, encountered Sherman frontal armor up to 75 millimeters thick when measured perpendicular to the surface. The sloped armor plates increased this effective thickness even further, creating protection levels that Japanese weapons simply could not overcome. Private Kubo attempted to reach another disabled Japanese tank, where he could see movement in the commander's cupola, hoping to assist wounded crew members or recover useful equipment. American rifle fire from Marine positions forced him to take cover behind coral outcroppings, the bullets chipping fragments from the limestone formations around him. The battlefield was becoming increasingly dangerous for dismounted personnel, as both sides' infantry engaged in close-range combat among the burning vehicles. The realization that their tanks were effectively useless against American armor spread through Japanese ranks like a contagion. Crews that had approached the battle with confidence in their equipment and training now faced the psychological burden of fighting with weapons they knew could not harm their enemies. This knowledge transformed aggressive tank commanders into desperate men seeking any possible means to achieve their mission objectives. As dawn approached, the scope of the Japanese disaster became fully apparent. 37 of Colonel Goto's original 44 tanks lay destroyed or abandoned across the battlefield, their crews either dead, wounded, or scattered among the coral formations as dismounted infantry. The largest tank assault in Pacific War history had been shattered by American weapons that Japanese intelligence had never properly assessed. Staff Sergeant Ernest Diller's Sherman had fired 23 rounds of 75mm ammunition since the engagement began, and his gunner reported 11 confirmed hits on Japanese tanks. The M4's reliability became its greatest asset as the battle continued. While enemy vehicles burned and broke down around the battlefield, American tanks maintained their fighting capability through superior engineering and robust construction. The Sherman's mechanical components had been designed for mass production and field maintenance, qualities that proved decisive when sustained combat tested every system to its limits. The versatility of American armor revealed itself as Marine. Tank crews adapted their tactics to exploit Japanese weaknesses. Lieutenant Robert Hayes, commanding a platoon of 4 Shermans, coordinated his vehicles to provide mutual support while engaging targets at different ranges simultaneously. 2 tanks provided overwatch from hull-down positions behind coral ridges, while the other 2 maneuvered to flank Japanese positions. This flexibility contrasted sharply with rigid Japanese doctrine that emphasized massed frontal assaults. Captain William Morrison, the 2nd Tank Battalion's operations officer, monitored the battle from his command post and recognized the opportunity to demonstrate combined arms coordination. He directed artillery forward observers to mark Japanese tank concentrations with white phosphorus shells, creating reference points for Sherman gunners while simultaneously obscuring enemy vision with dense smoke clouds. The 105mm howitzers could not penetrate tank armor directly, but their high explosive shells proved devastating against Japanese infantry supporting the armored assault. The Sherman's gun sight advantages became apparent as daylight improved visibility across the battlefield. American tanks mounted periscopic sights that allowed gunners to engage targets while remaining protected inside their vehicles, while Japanese tanks relied on direct optical sights that required crew members to expose themselves for accurate fire. This disparity in fire control systems gave Sherman crews decisive advantages in target acquisition and engagement accuracy, allowing them to achieve first-round hits at ranges where Japanese gunners struggled to identify targets. Corporal Thomas Bradley, driving Diller's Sherman, demonstrated the M4's mechanical reliability by maintaining mobility despite multiple non-penetrating hits from Japanese weapons. The tank's transmission continued operating smoothly, its tracks remained intact, and its engine maintained full power output throughout the engagement. Japanese tanks, by contrast, suffered mechanical failures even from near-miss artillery rounds that damaged external components and disrupted delicate systems. The logistic superiority that enabled American success extended beyond individual tank performance to encompass ammunition supply and maintenance support. Each Sherman carried 71 rounds of main gun ammunition in multiple types, allowing crews to select the most appropriate projectile for each target. High explosive shells proved highly effective against Japanese infantry positions. while armor-piercing rounds easily penetrated enemy tank armor when clear shots presented themselves. White phosphorus rounds created smoke screens that concealed American movements while blinding Japanese gunners. Marine infantry coordination with tank units exemplified the combined arms doctrine that American forces had perfected through extensive training and combat experience. Sergeant Major Robert Brown's riflemen provided close protection for Sherman tanks, preventing Japanese infantry from approaching with satchel charges or magnetic mines. In return, the tanks provided direct fire support against enemy positions that infantry weapons could not effectively engage, creating a symbiotic relationship that maximized both forces' capabilities. The M1A1 bazooka teams integrated seamlessly into this combined arms system, their shoulder-fired rockets complementing tank guns and artillery fires. Corporal James Mitchell positioned his bazooka team to cover approaches that Sherman tanks could not observe, ensuring that surviving Japanese vehicles could not escape or regroup for another assault. The 2.36-inch rockets proved devastatingly effective against Japanese tank armor, penetrating side and rear plates that had been designed to stop only rifle bullets and shell fragments. Radio communication networks gave American forces unprecedented coordination capabilities during the engagement. Each Sherman tank carried an SCR 508 radio that provided crystal-clear voice communication with other tanks, infantry units, and artillery observers. This communication network allowed Lieutenant Colonel Puller to coordinate defensive fires in real time, directing tank movements and artillery strikes with precision that Japanese commanders could not match using their limited radio equipment. The industrial capacity that had produced the Sherman tank became evident in its combat performance characteristics. Detroit's assembly lines had prioritized reliability and maintainability over exotic technical features, creating a vehicle that could absorb battle damage and continue fighting effectively. The tank's sloped armor design, borrowed from earlier American tank development programs, provided superior protection compared to the vertical plates used on Japanese vehicles, deflecting enemy shells that would have penetrated conventional armor arrangements. American crews demonstrated superior training and tactical flexibility as the battle progressed. Diller's gunner, Corporal Michael Sullivan, had practiced target engagement procedures until they became instinctive, allowing him to achieve rapid, accurate fire even under the stress of combat. His loader, Private Danny Rodriguez, maintained steady ammunition supply despite the confined space and constant movement of their tank, ensuring that the 75mm gun never fell silent for lack of shells. The Sherman's mechanical systems proved their worth as the engagement entered its second hour. The tank's General Motors diesel engine provided reliable power output without overheating, while the transmission shifted smoothly between gears despite the rough coral terrain. Japanese tanks, designed with less robust components and inadequate cooling systems, began suffering mechanical failures even without enemy fire, their crews forced to abandon vehicles that could no longer move or fight effectively. Artillery support reached maximum effectiveness as Marine forward observers established clear observation posts and communication links with firing batteries. The 105mm howitzers could place shells within 50 meters of designated targets, close enough to disable Japanese tanks through concussion effects, while remaining safely distant from American positions. This precision fire support represented another dimension of combined arms coordination the Japanese forces could not match. The technological advantages built into Sherman tanks extended to their crew survivability features. Thick armor plates protected vital crew positions, while the tank's internal layout minimized the effects of armor penetration when it occurred. Japanese shells that did manage to penetrate Sherman armor often failed to cause crew casualties because of the vehicle's spacious interior and protective arrangements around critical crew stations. Supply lines established during the Saipan landing operation ensured that American tank units maintained full ammunition loads and mechanical readiness throughout the engagement. Logistics personnel had pre-positioned supplies of 75mm shells, replacement parts, and fuel within easy reach of combat positions, allowing tank crews to focus entirely on fighting rather than worrying about material shortages. This logistical superiority reflected the industrial and organizational advantages that characterized American military operations throughout the Pacific War. The M4 Sherman's adaptability revealed itself as crews modified their tactics to exploit specific Japanese weaknesses. Some tank commanders used high-explosive shells to create dust clouds that concealed their movements, while others fired white phosphorus rounds to mark targets for artillery observers. This tactical creativity, supported by abundant ammunition supplies and reliable mechanical systems, demonstrated the flexibility that mass-produced American equipment could provide to well-trained crews operating within an effective combined arms framework. As the sun rose higher over Saipan's coral landscape, the superiority of American armor and tactics had transformed Colonel Goto's confident assault into a catastrophic defeat that would reshape Japanese understanding of modern tank warfare. Colonel Yoshitsugu Goto's radio fell silent at 0630 hours, his command tank among the final vehicles destroyed in what had become the complete annihilation of Japanese armor doctrine in the Pacific Theater. The 9th Tank Regiment, which had represented the pinnacle of Imperial Japanese Army mechanized warfare, ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. 42 of the original 44 tanks lay scattered across Saipan's coral battlefield as smoking monuments to the failure of outdated tactical thinking against modern industrial warfare. Private First Class Mitsuo Kubo crouched among the wreckage of his Chiha tank, watching American Sherman tanks methodically patrol the battlefield like predators surveying their domain. The sight crystallized everything that had gone wrong with Japanese armor development over the previous decade. While American industry had focused on mass production of reliable, well-protected vehicles, Japanese designers had prioritized speed and maneuverability over survivability, creating tanks that could not withstand the realities of mechanized combat against a technologically superior enemy. The strategic implications of the tank battle extended far beyond the immediate tactical defeat on Saipan's beaches. Japanese military planners in Tokyo had counted on armor superiority to offset American advantages in naval aviation and artillery support during the defense of the Mariana Islands. The complete failure of the largest tank assault in Pacific War history demonstrated that Japanese forces could not achieve decisive results through conventional armored operations against American combined arms teams. Staff Sergeant Ernest Diller's Sherman crew began the grim task of battlefield assessment, counting destroyed enemy vehicles and identifying equipment that might provide intelligence value. The disparity in combat effectiveness became starkly apparent as American tanks moved freely across terrain littered with Japanese armor. Where Sherman tanks had absorbed multiple hits without significant damage, even single American shells had proven lethal against Japanese vehicles whose thin armor provided no meaningful protection. The industrial capacity that had created the Sherman tank revealed its full strategic importance through the vehicle's combat performance characteristics. American factories had produced over 49,000 M4 tanks by 1944, creating a mass of reliable armor that could absorb losses while maintaining operational effectiveness. Japanese industry, constrained by resource limitations and competing priorities, had built fewer than 6,000 tanks of all types throughout the entire war, making each loss strategically significant. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Puller surveyed the aftermath of the engagement from his command post, recognizing that the Japanese defeat represented more than tactical failure. It demonstrated the complete obsolescence of Imperial Japanese Army doctrine when confronted by American military-industrial capabilities. The mass tank assault that should have driven his Marines back into the sea had instead provided a devastating example of how superior equipment and training could overcome numerical odds. The technological revolution embodied in the Sherman tank extended beyond armor thickness and gun caliber to encompass every aspect of modern warfare. Radio communication networks had allowed American forces to coordinate fires and movement with precision that Japanese commanders could not match using flag signals and written orders. Mechanical reliability had kept Sherman tanks operational throughout sustained combat, while Japanese vehicles suffered breakdowns from battle damage and inadequate maintenance support. Sergeant Major Robert Brown organized recovery operations to clear disabled Japanese tanks from Marine positions, each burned-out hull providing evidence of American firepower superiority. The 47mm guns that had proven so ineffective against Sherman armor represented the best anti-tank weapons Japan could deploy in the Pacific theater. Their failure demonstrated that Japanese forces lacked any meaningful capability to engage American armor on equal terms. The human cost of doctrinal failure became apparent as Marine medics counted Japanese casualties among the tank crews. Each destroyed vehicle had carried 4 to 5 crew members, representing the loss of experienced specialists who had trained for years to operate Japan's most sophisticated military equipment. These losses could not be easily replaced, particularly as American bombing campaigns disrupted Japanese training facilities and reduced access to fuel for realistic exercises. Corporal James Mitchell's bazooka team recovered unexploded Japanese shells from the battlefield, providing ordnance specialists with examples of enemy ammunition that had failed to penetrate American armor. The 47mm armor-piercing rounds showed clear evidence of deflection and fragmentation against Sherman tank plates, confirming that Japanese weapons lacked the penetrating power necessary for effective anti-tank operations. The logistical implications of the Japanese defeat extended beyond immediate battlefield losses to encompass the broader strategic situation facing Imperial forces throughout the Pacific. Each tank destroyed on Saipan represented months of production time and scarce raw materials that could not be replaced given American submarine warfare against Japanese supply lines. The loss of trained crew members created additional problems for Japanese commanders already struggling with personnel shortages. Captain William Morrison filed detailed after-action reports describing the engagement's lessons for future armor operations in the Pacific theater. His analysis emphasized how Sherman tank crews had adapted their tactics during combat, using high-explosive shells against infantry positions and armor-piercing rounds against vehicle targets with deadly efficiency. This tactical flexibility, supported by abundant ammunition supplies, had multiplied the effectiveness of American armor throughout the engagement. The failure of Japanese armor doctrine reverberated through imperial military planning as senior officers recognized that conventional tank assaults could not succeed against American defensive positions. The massed attack that had worked effectively against Chinese forces in Manchuria had proven suicidal when attempted against Marines equipped with modern anti-tank weapons and supported by artillery observers who could coordinate precise fire missions. Private Kubo began the dangerous journey back to Japanese lines, moving carefully through coral formations to avoid American patrols searching for survivors. His experience represented that of hundreds of Japanese soldiers whose confidence in their equipment and tactics had been shattered by contact with American military capabilities. The psychological impact of such complete defeat would influence Japanese defensive planning for the remainder of the Pacific War. The strategic consequences of Goto's failed assault became apparent as American forces consolidated their beachhead without significant interference from Japanese armor. The tanks that should have disrupted Marine supply operations and prevented the establishment of artillery positions had been eliminated before they could affect the broader campaign. This failure ensured that subsequent Japanese defensive efforts would rely primarily on infantry weapons and fortifications rather than mobile counterattacks. The Sherman tank's success on Saipan validated American industrial and tactical approaches that emphasized reliability over sophistication, mass production over individual excellence, and combined arms coordination over single weapon solutions. These principles, refined through combat experience and supported by overwhelming industrial capacity, had created military capabilities that Japanese forces could not match despite their courage and determination. The wreckage scattered across Saipan's battlefield provided a stark illustration of how technological evolution had transformed modern warfare. The tanks that had dominated Asian battlefields during the 1930s had become obsolete death traps when confronted by weapons designed for European combat conditions. This technological gap, rooted in industrial capacity and research priorities, would determine the outcome of armored engagements throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. As the sun reached its zenith over Saipan on June 17, 1944, the largest tank battle in Pacific War history had concluded with a victory so complete that it fundamentally altered Japanese strategic planning and demonstrated the decisive advantages that American industry and innovation could provide on 20th century battlefields.